Good afternoon. Welcome to this month's installment of Creation Justice Webinars. I am Brooks Berndt, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. As always, I am joined by the Reverend Michael Malcom, who wears the mantle of justice in Birmingham, Alabama, where he directs the People's Justice Council and Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. Michael, during this pandemic, I must say I've really been looking forward to our webinars together for a couple of reasons. First, as always, great to have these educational, inspiring guests that we have with us. And second, it's so easy to feel isolated and alone in the struggle right now as we're in this pandemic. But for this 1 hour, we get to connect with people throughout the country. People who have that passionate commitment to justice, that passionate commitment to each other and to God's creation. And so it's a reminder that we are all together in this struggle. We're not alone. And so I'm grateful for this opportunity to be with everybody today. Before we get into the introductions of our speakers, Michael, do you have a theological framing for us today?
Yeah, thank you, Brooks. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you, Senator Booker and Dr. Dominici for being with us as well. My theological framing today, I actually was reflecting on a song by Mahalia Jackson that says, if I can help somebody as I travel along, if I could help somebody with a word or a song, if I could help somebody from doing wrong, no, my living shall not be in vain. It goes on to say, if I could teach someone as the master taught, if I could help someone who's on the road once wrought, then my living will not be in vain. My brothers and my sisters, today we are faced with a pandemic that none of us have even imagined that we would ever be in. It's been said that the science has told us that we'll see pandemics like this and even worse as we look at climate change. But none of us have truly expected this in our minds, that things would be the way that they are. And the response thereof has not been the best. And so as a result, it's left all of us a little bit off balance. But we as a communities of faith, we as those who are faith leaders, now is the time for us to take a stance. And I'm grateful for those that we have as guests today who help us to see both from the environmental justice aspect of this, also from the governmental response to this, as well as, and which is extremely important, the academic. It is with head and heart that we love our God. And so my brothers and my sisters, it's well-informed worship, it's well-informed praise that we come to find out and be more informed about on today. So we thank you again as our guests. We ask that you would just lean in and listen in as they speak to us today. Thank you.
Thank you for those words, Michael. Always appreciate having your voice getting us grounded and centered as we begin. Let me now introduce our three speakers. I'll begin with our final speaker who will bring us home, the Reverend Lionel Murphy, pastors in Reserve, Louisiana. As some in our audience might know, Reserve was the focus of a series of articles in The Guardian last year and regularly covered by Julie Dermansky with the smog. And it's all because Reserve is known, sadly, for having the highest risk of cancer for its residents in this country of ours, a risk 50 times that of the national average. In the midst of this crisis, Reverend Murphy's church became a center of local organizing. Concerned citizens of St. John began holding bi-weekly meetings. And with a pandemic crisis on top of a pollution crisis, Reverend Murphy has continued to persevere, to minister, and to be a light for others. Our second speaker will be Francesca Dominici, who is the director of the Harvard Data Science Initiative at Harvard University and the Clarence James Gamble Professor of Biostatistics, Population and Data Science at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. In addition to the many academic honors and awards, Dr. Dominici distinguishes herself by the moral drive of her research that has a public impact. She leads an interdisciplinary group of scientists with the ultimate goal of addressing important questions in environmental health science, about climate change and health policy. Her studies have directly and routinely impacted air quality policy. Her work has been covered by the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, BBC, The Guardian, CNN, and NPR. In 2020, she was awarded the Carl E. Peace Award for outstanding statistical contributions for the betterment of society by the American Statistical Association. So glad to have her with us today. And now for the speaker who will get us started, Cory Booker. In introducing the senator, I could trace his political biography as a councilman, mayor, and senator. I could mention his role as a founding member of the Senate's Environmental Justice Caucus and how he made environmental justice an important part of his presidential campaign. But I will deviate from the standard script a little bit. They say confession is good for the soul. So I will confess, I have long suffered from an inner spiritual struggle to extend the circle of love to include elected officials. Yes, I need your prayer, but I want to share with you that this past week, I listened to the audiobook version of Senator Booker's autobiography. And while doing my Fitbit laps around the neighborhood, he somehow managed to bring down all of my defenses and walls of suspicion. So I highly recommend to our audience that you get to know the person of Cory Booker by reading that book. And so without further ado, we will hand things over to the senator and you can take things away.
You and I, first of all, Michael Brooks, God bless you both. You are a gift to me today in the midst of this crisis, in the midst of the challenges. You two are light workers. And in that book, I wrote a longer piece, but I always say that before you tell me about your religion, first show it to me in how you treat other people, how well you love, how well you serve, how much you sacrifice, and how much you fight for justice for those folks that are not related to you or that you may not even ever meet. And you two are people that live your faith in a way that inspires me, and I'm grateful. And I was laughing at that introduction because I always say, be careful what you don't like, because God will draw that energy to yourself. And I was a guy who grew up in the nonprofit world and was so suspicious of elected officials all the time and their motives. And next thing you knew, I was one of them. So just thank you for this conversation. And let me just jump right in that I live in Newark, New Jersey. I'm proud of my community. It is a community of great wealth, but we don't confuse wealth with worth. And the wealth I'm talking about in my community is spiritual wealth. We are a low-income community. My neighborhood, in fact, I have the map of my neighborhood right up here. The first people ever take a risk on me to elect me to a city council seat. The median income of the last census was about $14,000 per household. And it was the community that made me really become an environmental justice activist. Because the more I knew the history of Newark and my city, it used to be a place where people could fish if you were low income. You could go clamming, you could plant in the soil and really grow food. You could connect with your environment in substantive ways. But if you know the history of my city, like so many cities, that land, that bounty, that abundance was stolen by the greed of corporations who privatized their profits, but pushed out through their pollution the costs of what they were doing. And I see firsthand what that tragedy is, the deep injustices, and how it visits upon neighborhoods like mine all across the country, where you literally have an environment so toxic that the air you breathe, the soil beneath your feet, and in fact, the water you drink is a threat to your own lifestyle, to your own well-being. When I'm home in Newark, I know the reality and the data. I'm in the 5-mile radius of not one, but 2 toxic Superfund sites. Once abandoned by corporations, have been allowed to let their toxic chemicals seep into our land, threaten our water, our health, and our environment. We know from longitudinal studies, children born around Superfund sites have higher rates of autism, higher rates of birth defects. The air is polluted, as we find. Just a few towns over, our asthma rates are so much higher than those surrounding suburban towns. And this isn't specific to Newark. I've had the opportunity to travel to communities all around our country and see this. 3,000 communities in America where children have more than twice the blood lead levels of Flint, Michigan. I was in Tallahassee and Uniontown, Alabama, visiting with residents whose quality of life has been ruined by giant industrial garbage dumps that were moved into their neighborhoods against their will. I saw the bayous and marshes of Southeast Louisiana where residents in that parish are faced with coastal land, a loss of coastal land that has been driven by decades of industrial scale energy development. And St. James Parish, I sat with residents who battled chronic illnesses and lost, I'll never forget that day in a small Black church in an area called Cancer Alley, where resident after resident told me about their relatives, family members, friends who died for cancer, but can't afford to move away because they can't sell their homes because folks don't want to buy them. Centuries of policy going up to the present day in our country, from federal housing policies that redline neighborhoods, carved up cities, allowed pollution, disinvestment in neighborhoods and communities of color, created a reality where now, especially among African Americans, that you see higher rates of respiratory diseases and more likely for low-income communities and communities of color to face these preventable health crises. And the environmental racism has to be called out because, it was just a 2016 study that found a person's race is the single biggest factor of whether they live near a toxic waste site or not. So from communities like mine, there is a moral urgency in this country where you see children missing school because of asthma or having permanent brain damage because of lead, where they go to a hospital because of often these crises, their families have to take time off work, threaten to have loss of jobs, loss of economic strength and stability. These are problems that compound upon themselves and affect every area of our nation. The well-being of our communities, the very ideals of having life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness being stripped away from folks by no fault of their own, but because of the persistence of these environmental injustices. And now I'm seeing headlines. The coronavirus seems to be bringing headlines where people are becoming more aware of the disparities of health outcomes in our country. And we see how this virus is preying upon that fragility, preying upon those injustices, aggravating them and making the outcomes even worse. We know that people of color who do not receive the care that they need, who see awful ugliness when it comes to just coming to life. The infant mortality rates, the maternal mortality rates for Black women are 4 times out of white women. We know that this invisible virus now is preying upon all of these disparities and making them worse. And so we cannot go back to normal. We all have to be saying in a common chorus of conviction that going back to normal after this coronavirus is not an option. We have to move to a new normal. And in this virus, with this virus, it means stepping up, testing, and contact tracing and applying resources to those areas hardest hit, from the Navajo Nation to low-income communities. It means guaranteeing that everyone in our country, including regardless of their immigration status, has access to critical care, because all of us in this country, whether you are documented or not, have a common destiny because of the way this virus works, common health destiny. It means ensuring that we are properly paying and training and protecting workers on the front line who often are the lowest income workers. Essential workers are not just a name and a label. We can't treat them like they're expendable. We have to step up to support them, and that includes hazard pay. In the long term, this means working to reverse a systemic disinvestment and outright discrimination that's brought us to this point, especially when it comes to environmental policy. That's why I'm proud to be working with activists across this space. And that's why I'm proud to have worked with those activists to write the first major comprehensive Environmental Justice Act to begin to address environmental injustices. And just to let you know that our act would codify and expand upon the progress we've made over the last 25 years under President Clinton and Obama. It would require the EPA and states to consider the cumulative impact of pollution before granting any new Clean Air or Clean Water Act permits. And it would override 2 Supreme Court decisions and allow communities that are being disproportionately harmed by pollution to have access to the federal courts to protect themselves. And that's why I'm working on a new bill I'll introduce soon that will help communities that are already overburdened by air pollution. My new bill will ensure that no permits can be granted to new sources of air pollution in communities that are already overpolluted, like so many communities across our country are in places from New Jersey to Louisiana. And it will force existing sources of air pollution to shut down in the coming years to protect the health of local residents who have too long suffered. We have much work to do. And I haven't even begun to talk about industrial scale factory farming and what that is doing with these massive CAFOs and the legislation I'm working now to reverse this new concentrated animal international corporations that are destroying our ecology through their practices that are hurting so many communities, forcing independent family farmers out of business or into near sharecropping conditions, poisoning our rivers and our lakes. We have work to do, and I'm committed to stand with you in this fight so that we truly can be a nation where justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream, a clean, mighty stream. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Your tangible commitment and word and deed is much appreciated. And now we will transition to our second speaker, Dr. Francesca Dominici.
Thank you, and thank you, Senator, for your very inspiring remark. Thank you for the invitation. I am truly honored to be here. I will share with you what I have learned so far about this horrible pandemic. I also wanted to do that with humility, with compassion, and with kindness. I will try to tell you a little bit of how we can connect the dots between environmental justice and coronavirus. We are at war against this invisible enemy, the COVID-19, which attack our lungs. And at the same time, the Environmental Protection Agency, in response to this coronavirus pandemics, plans to implement sweeping changes that will relax environmental regulations. So keep in mind that this action will all have the same result, will increase the pollution in the air, will increase the levels of fine particulate matter during a pandemic that attacks, among other things, our lungs. Severe COVID-19 can cause a viral pneumonia and complication, including acute respiratory distress syndrome. And acute respiratory distress syndrome has a mortality rate at between 27 and 45%. So the first point I want to make is that even before the pandemic, we and my team and my wonderful student have conducted studies that demonstrate that historical exposure to fine particulate matter increases the rate of all-cause mortality. We conducted a very large study of over 60 million of Americans. It was published in New England Journal of Medicine. The Senator Booker comment on it. And what we found there is that exposure to even low level of fine particulate matter increased the mortality rate by 7%. That means that even small changes of fine particulate matter kills 12,000 Americans a year, 12,000 Americans. At the same time, also in the same study, we reported the long-term exposure to fine particulate matter increase. The rate of mortality for fine particulate matter is 3 times higher among Afro-Americans than the rest of the nation. And that's after you account for poverty and socioeconomic status. So 3 times higher. There are many studies all around the world that have demonstrated that exposure to fine particulate matter increase the risk of a lot of health and a lot of health problems and diseases, including heart attacks, lung disease, aggravated asthma, decreased lung function, coughing, and difficult breathing. Now, I want to make the second point. I will make 4 points in total. My second point is that COVID and air pollution are even more dangerous together. We found that historical exposure to fine particulate matter is much more dangerous for people that have COVID, that is in general. And we made this dangerous connection because we learned that the great majority of these preclinical conditions that lead to worse health outcome for COVID are the same diseases that are affected by air pollution. We recently conducted a study that includes over 3,000 counties in the United States, 97% of the population. We were able to leverage what we have been doing, studying health effects of air pollution. And we found that even a small change in fine particulate matter increase the mortality rate for COVID by 8%. So this is a third point I want to make. The mortality rate for COVID-19 is much higher for racial minorities. I want to make a quote. I want to state a quote from Martin Luther King that really resonates with me. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And so while cities and towns across the US wrestle with the devastating impact of the coronavirus epidemic, none have been hit harder than low-income and minority community. Places like Detroit, Chicago, St. James Parish in Louisiana, they have plagued by decades of economic inequality and pollution, and have experienced some of the highest mortality rate from the virus. And when I'm mentioning these numbers are our grandmas, our grandpa, our friends. These are people that have been affected, and these are only numbers. These are people that we have lost. So to give you an example, in Chicago, more than 50% of COVID-19 cases and nearly 70% of COVID deaths involve Afro-American. This is despite Afro-American are only 30% of the population. In Louisiana, it's been even worse. 70% of deaths have occurred among Afro-Americans, who represent only 32% of the state population. And so our results and all our study that we have conducted are consistent with previously reported findings that Afro-American are at higher risk of COVID-19 mortality than other groups. Looking at our own data on a national scale, we found a 45% increase in COVID mortality rate when comparing a county that has a little bit higher percentage of Afro-American. There are many explanations. The 3 most common explanation is that first, racial and ethnic minority population have a disproportionate burden of underlying comorbidity. That's true for diabetes, cardiovascular disease, asthma, liver disease, and also for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Second, racial and ethnic minorities and poor people in urban setting live in more crowded conditions, both by neighbors and household, and are more likely to be employed in public face occupation that will prevent physical distancing. Third is that we know from the data that racial ethnic minority live in geographical areas that have higher level of air pollution. and are generally, and so the higher level of fine particulate matters, an area they are generally more polluted. These patterns in the United States is that community of colors and low-income communities host most of the heavily polluted land uses. So I think that this has played a major role in why we see the disparate impact of COVID-19 as it relates to morbidity and mortality rates in this community. And so to address this, we need to fix all of these three problems. The death rate for COVID-19 for predominantly Afro-American counties is 6 times higher than in predominantly white community. So even though our data is a preliminary study and we need to study these issues further, the pattern is clear. Underrepresented minority are developing the COVID-19 infection more frequently and dying disproportionately, and breathing more polluted air is likely to be a critically important factors. So to address this disparity in COVID-19, we have to address our structural inequality in this country. To end, I wanted to say my 4th point, coronavirus is not just a health crisis, it's an environmental justice crisis. COVID-19 has highlighted what many of us have known for decades, that we have a lot of haves in this country, the rich, but we have also a lot of non-haves, the poor. Our policy, including environmental policy, benefit the rich while disproportionately impact the poor. So we have a lot of communities, our senator said, that are basically sacrifice zones because they're dumping grounds for polluting facility. So what is our action plan? I think it's less of an action plan, it's more of a commitment. The 6-fold increase in death rate for Afro-American to an ubiquitous virus seems to be deemed unconscionable. This is a moment of ethical reckoning. The scourge of COVID-19 will end, but healthcare disparities will persist. To address the disparity in COVID-19, we have to address our structural inequality in this country. While this might seem an insurmountable task, one aspect is clear: rolling back environmental regulation to protect the air we breathe, it's not acceptable and puts thousands of lives at risk. Air pollution kills, and recent decision of the administration to increase these levels is dangerous and deadly and place some of our more vulnerable at even high risk for COVID-19. So I wanted to conclude by saying where we live, how much money we make, should not determine the quality of the air we breathe. We all have a right to breathe cleaner air, and tighter, no looser regulation will guarantee that. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you for articulating the moral reckoning before us. And for those in our audience, I will make sure we get some links to those studies that were cited and mentioned, because I think that's something that we all need to sit with a while and fully absorb those statistics that were cited. We'll now transition to our 3rd speaker and our final speaker. We are so grateful to have the Reverend Lionel Murphy with us. Reverend Murphy, we introduced you earlier and we'll let you take things away.
Okay. I first want to say thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conference. I really appreciate that. I've met Senator Booker, in fact, about a year or so ago on the campaign trail, I believe, and he was here with environmental issues. I shook his hand and I told him, I say, I think you're going to be president someday. But I do believe that, and I'm going to be praying for that. I first want to say that in St. John the Baptist Parish, we are about a population of about 50,000 people. We're about 60% African-American. And we have had a problem with pollution for many years. We're in Cancer Alley. I was raised here in Louisiana, born in New Orleans, raised along the river in Port Allen, Louisiana, moved down to St. John Parish about 22 years ago. We started a church here that's 21 years old now. And we quickly found out that there was a lot more issues here with health than I was accustomed to, even though I lived along the river where there were chemical plants. But that here in St. John Parish, right along the river here, we have some plants here that have done a lot of damage. The cancer rate was very high. We've had studies done by Stanford and other people who've come down, who've shown that our cancer risk as we get closer to some plants, as we live closer to certain plants, goes up higher. Not only our risk for cancer, but all kinds of autoimmune diseases, including diabetes, lupus, and all kinds of other things. When I got here, it's a little bit different than my home parish, but the poverty level is substantially high. I think we may have as much as 20% in poverty here. That's pretty high. But the thing that got us the most was the environmental issues. And our church started after I visited a group of environmentalists. We started being more active in the environmental movement a few years ago, about 5 years ago. There's one particular plant that has been designated the culprit for most of the environmental issues we're having in our particular area. It's owned by DuPont and Dinka Corporation. We've been very vocal against it, the work they're doing. We've created an organization, at least there's an organization that was founded out of our church that has been established, St. John Concerned Citizens. And we've been very active to try to do something to reduce the amount of chloroquine that plant seems to emit, that seems to pollute our air with. And we've been very, very concerned about it in particular because it has been proven to be highly carcinogenic. And we just need some help in that area. We've had a lot of help. Senator Booker came down and brought some attention to our issues. But what I want to say is this pandemic has really aggravated things. We have had 77 deaths as of yesterday out of 800 cases. So we're running about 10% deaths for a small parish. Per capita, we're the highest in the state and at one time in the nation. So we know that it's been way before this that we've had chemical issues that affected our lungs, and it's really aggravated the situation by having this pandemic. And we are very, I guess fear is the word now. We just recently had our church service for the first time. I had to take a lot of precautions to do that. But because we're small in a small area, we also have a school that's just feet from this plant. We're young children elementary school. And our water is not good and our air is not good. And so there's a great need for some kind of help. There is not a lot of activism in our community with churches. Ours is one of the few. If out of 65 in this small parish, we have at least 65 or 60 or more churches here. And to get people to become active and to fight the environmental issues here, which I think is a justice issue. And I'm pretty sure that we serve a God that is a just God. And so we can't get a lot of motivation from the grassroots yet. We're trying hard to bring attention to the issue, but there's a sense in our community that's similar to many, that we can't do anything at all. The politicians, and we've had Black politicians, Black sheriff, we just recently had 8 years in office, a Black parish president. Being a minority doesn't make you want to change things, as you may know, in politics. So we have to elect the right people in office who's going to do the right thing, regardless of color. So I'm very concerned about where we're headed. I think things are slowing up a little bit as far as the death rate here, but it's taken a big toll, created a great deal of fear and anxiety. And if anything else comes out of this, I hope we become more active in our community to kind of resist this particular plant that's close to our school system from aggravating us any more than what it has done. So I appreciate what you are doing. I think is awesome. And I think to see a church involved in this is just almost just wonderful to me. Our politicians here have failed us. but our churches have to get more involved. And to see your church really being involved has really, really emboldened me to do more for our parish here. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you, Reverend Murphy. Your courage is contagious, and thank you for sharing with us. We'll now transition to our Q&A portion. If you are an audience member, you can type in questions for our panelists in the Q&A icon. You'll see it at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that and type in a question for any of our panelists. We'll start off with a question for Senator Booker. We have a question asking, how would you reach across the aisle to Republicans and conservatives to garner their support for legislation that would clean up these toxic hotspots? Your thoughts on that question? Let's see, we need to unmute.
I muted myself, forgive me. I'm really glad you asked that question, because if you look at the great movements of the past, they weren't cast as partisan movements. They were people appealing to the moral imagination of all Americans. Martin Luther King, didn't march for a party. He marched for the larger moral justice of our nation. And I really think that that's what we've got to do, is cast environmental justice issues in the fullness and the breadth, frankly, that they belong. And the allowing corporations, which is very much against the ideals of the free market, to create something and not have what's called full cost accounting. In other words, that they produce something this doesn't evidence the full cost, including the pollution, and we allow them to keep pushing that out onto the community and spoiling what's called the commons, then that's unacceptable. So I do a lot of work across the aisle. We just passed a major criminal justice bill that's led to the liberation of thousands of Americans. Overwhelmingly, under one provision, thousands of Americans got released. 90% of them were African American. And so I think that this has got to be a moral movement and not a partisan one. And the way I often will outreach to my Republican colleagues will be trying to meet them where they're at. Maybe it is a religious position. Maybe it is an economic analysis of what's the best to create wealth and create prosperity for all. But I do want to say, though, that King said this so eloquently, where he said that what we have to repent for in our day and age is not the vitriolic words and violent actions, not just the vitriolic words and violent actions of the bad people, but it's also the appalling silence and inaction of the good people. And so sometimes it's not just reaching out to Republicans, it's trying to get more people to act. I'm in the Senate office, so I can't talk about like partisan politics, but I can say to you, we'd see a lot more change if a lot more people voted and exercised their power and pushed their issues. That's very important, that we have more participation, greater, more robust democracies. And often one of the things that dilutes people power and elevates corporate power is when and I always am a big believer, the power of the people is greater than the people in power. But if we don't use that people power through the activism, through the engagement, through the exercise of your franchise, then we are never going to make the kind of change we need. Remember, the civil rights movement was successful. The suffrage movement was successful. I can go through the movements that were successful because they were able to activate people that normally are on the sidelines and get them into the field of activism.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Booker. Next question is for Dr. Domenici. Can we get a link to the EJ Act bill and do we know how it will relate to the Green New Deal? I think that's more for for Senator Booker than it is for Dr. Domenici. But can we get a link to the EJ Act bill?
Yes.
And how does it relate to the Green New Deal's ideals?
Yeah, if one of my staffers will text it to me right now, I'll post it in the, I'll post the link here in the chat section, or they can do it themselves. And then these are all, I think somebody just did it, yep. These are all interrelated. So remember, the Green New Deal is not a bill yet. It is a large, inspiring policy statement. And what we need to do is make sure that we translate that into actual legislation and then fight to get that legislation forward. But the Green New Deal, a lot of its pillars, from all the jobs that we could create in the environmental justice realm, the fact that we, and through the Green New Deal, have a vision for a new energy economy, all of these things are really important for us to know and advocate for, but ultimately the policy, the bills themselves have to be passed.
Thank you. I guess the next question I can ask for Doc. Someone said, I'm working in a community surrounded by traffic with multiple patrol.
And we did have a question for Dr. Domenici to.
Kate, Brooks, I think you might have froze up. I'll go back to my question real quick. It says, with multiple petroleum cleanup sites and a Superfund site that is being remediated,
I'm good.
Where can we find information that will help us to qualify the risk from COVID in a community with US NATA diesel particulate matter at 0.941? And yeah, it gives a great deal of various controls here, but I can't necessarily go into those. But they're asking where can they find information to qualify these particulate matters?
Yeah. So first of all, I think one question just before I respond to that, I was asked to define what's fine particulate matter. And so let's start with that. So fine particulate matters, these are really, really tiny particles. These are air droplets. They have a diameter of less than 2.5 microns. So the diameter is 100th of the diameter of the size of a human hair. So these are really, really tiny. They when you breathe them, you are not gonna realize anything. You can cough them out because they're so tiny. They penetrate deep into your lungs and can also get into your bloodstream. And they're caused by any type of combustion of fossil fuel, power plants, traffic, airplanes, industrial activities. So this is what is fine particulate matter. And the reason is that then we know, I mean, there is thousands of papers and research that when you're breathing fine particulate matters, they cause an inflammation in your lungs. Now, what we have found, going back to the second question about data regarding what is the relationship between living in a more polluted place and COVID-19, we have done our first study really 3 weeks ago, because COVID is so recent, where we have looked at the relationship between long-term exposure to fine particulate matter and COVID-19 mortality rate, and we found a strong evidence of a relationship. Having said that, more and more work needs to be done. So the data sources that that my friend pointed out there regarding the Superfunds and NATA sources and air toxic. So what we do in my lab is, this is our job. We gather all of the available data sources, including the one that you're mentioning. And that's what we're doing literally as we speak. And then we studied whether or not, if you're living close to a Superfund site, Superfund sites, you're gonna have a higher risk of COVID-19 mortality. So that work is in process because that's what we do. We try to gather information useful for policy regulation by looking specifically at data.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. And we have a question for Reverend Murphy. Someone is asking for kind of to help them to understand what are the impediments and the fears at the grassroots level keeping people from activism. If you could help explain that to us.
I think that is a very good question. Actually, a lot of it is history. It's cultural here. Most of the area we're in right now was plantation. And these plants came and located in the plantation areas, including in my hometown and in Reserve, Louisiana, where we are. Sugarcane surrounds the plants. Education has a lot to do with it, to be honest about it. I think our education here is not up to par. The people really need to be more educated about what's going on. I think it's the frustration of dealing with things that cannot be changed over a long period of time. I also think that we have these large plants that hire a lot of people. And, you know, economics has a lot to do with it. There are not a whole lot of job opportunities. Plants tend to be great jobs out here. And they contribute a lot to the economy of the parish here. So those are the factors that I see, and they're very difficult to change.
Pastor, when I visited your parish, I remember the day that I was there, a report was released about the particular matter being released in that area and how it was well over the federally allowable levels, but there was just no accountability to those corporations at all. And so you have the particular matter in your parish, and then you also have all that pollution coming down the river, which is runoff. A lot of it's even agricultural runoff. It's moving these large CAFOs that allow their the phosphates from all the feces that's flowing into those rivers that flows right through your community. So you have water, you have air. It's so bad that what's running through your community that one of the largest dead zones on the planet Earth is out in the Gulf when all flows out into the Gulf area. So you have that stuff running right in your community. You have the air toxins. And that's why one of the more painful meetings I've had in the 6 years I've been a senator was sitting in your community, listening to people tell their testimony about the outrageous numbers of cancers that folks have had. And so what the doctor was saying about particulate matter is frightening to know that folks have to breathe that in all the time, in addition to have what is polluted water running right through there. So it is a time for prayer. I was so shaken.
Precisely.
But it also is a time that our circles of empathy should be such that this should be more of a national cause, especially when I was being taught the history of your community, where that land, you know, we've gone back generations. My family's from Monroe area. And I know that land, folk have been on that land since slavery. I know my family was. And to have African-Americans who've been on this land indigenously almost for centuries, to now have their property value stolen from them, because the owners of those companies would never let their children grow up in that area. They would never let their families, but yet it's this callous disregard for those communities that allows them to be perpetrators in the death and destruction of your neighborhood. So I'm sorry, but we have to do something about it. To me, we have to.
Absolutely.
That leads to the next question, Senator Booker, and I guess actually I can ask all of you all from your various disciplines, whether it be from a government standpoint, whether it be from an academic and a science-based standpoint, and also Rev, whether it be from a faith-based standpoint. When we look at now with COVID, EPA has done a great deal of rollbacks. And so those communities who have been burdened are even more burdened now with very little oversight as to the burdens that they deal with. As community, what can we do immediately? What could our immediate response be to what we are experiencing when it comes down to this pollution? Many of us, in particular people who look like me, are sitting in this pollution and now have been sheltered in place while sitting in this pollution and have no regulatory, no regulations that can even help to alleviate any of the pain when we know that we suffer from it. So what can we as community of faith, community of science, what can we as community of advocates, what can we do to immediately get involved in helping out with this pandemic?
Wow. Well, one thing we need to do is get people out to vote for the right people, because without the political and the governmental arm working in our favor, it's going to be difficult to change anything. So we need people to register, to vote, and to vote on these types of issues?
So it's interesting that, you know, being trained as a scientist, I was trained for my entire career of never getting to making policy recommendation or never getting to thinking about politics. It was all about write your academic paper and don't say anything else. Well, forget that. Forget that. I think that it's really time that, in addition, as a scientist and the students, in addition of providing good science, which we have continued to do, it's time to take position and it's time to advocate what's the right thing to do. I think in academia and science, we are in a very privileged position. And I think it's our moral obligation to speak for our mind and what the science are teaching us. So bottom line is, I agree, vote for the right people, and really thinking that we need the government to solve this problem, because right now the current government has fired all the scientists to advise the EPA.
And then I'm going to try to add to that because, yeah, it makes a big difference. I know the difference between the EPA and the Obama administration, the EPA under this current administration, where they were literally the first person they put in charge, Pruitt. You know, I still remember his confirmation hearing, just bringing up to him the fact that he, in his previous job in his state, was actively working on literally taking things from corporations, reprinting them on his, I think it was Attorney General's stationery, and advocating for the undermining of the Obama administration's EPA policies. And that's everything from the rollback of methane rules, the rollback of fuel efficiency CAFE standards. So you see that here, and by the way, you can literally measure, and I'm sure the doctor can tell you this, the lives that could be lost when you roll back methane rules. We know that pollution literally kills people. And so the one thing I just want to say, in addition to somehow igniting people to vote their interests, again, I'm not advocating for who you vote for, but know your interest and vote your interest. I just want to say this, though, I've learned this, is that change has never been easy. It isn't. The civil rights laws were not easy. Voting rights laws were not easy. Damn, abolition wasn't easy. It took extraordinary sacrifice. And one thing that I found as I study history and try to look for instruction from history is, and this is where I'm put myself up on this. You're talking to a guy that, you know, I've lived on food stamps to try to bring attention to how outrageous it is to think people can live on $1.40 per meal. I've done a hunger strike for 10 days to bring attention to some projects when I was a city council person. I just want to say that we cannot leave out the idea that somehow we who are sort of woke on these issues have to start thinking of creative protest, of what we can do to bring along the consciousness of others to what the crisis is that we're living under, because there is a poverty of empathy going on in our country right now that we've got to somehow trigger a greater understanding that people live in communities like mine, communities like Reverend Murphy. So I just offer it up to the collective thought and prayer. I will go to back to St. James Parish if we want to do something. Heck, I don't know what that is. I just know that when Martin Luther King in May of 1963 was failing to organize in Birmingham, it was James Bevel and Dorothea Cotton that came up to him with a creative idea that he was resistant to at first, which was letting children march. He didn't want to do it. But they convinced him to allow everybody from 8 years old to 18 years old. I think Taylor Branch in his book calls it the children's miracle. And it so shocked the consciousness of the country to see children being attacked by dogs and fire hoses that the segregation in Birmingham fell within, like, I think 12 days. Because suddenly the world came down. Everybody from Joan Baez to Dick Gregory was coming down there to join with Fred Shuttlesworth, who like Reverend Murphy, was long suffering. He had his stabbed, his house bombed, and all the challenges. Well, that kind of violence is going on in Reverend Murphy's community right now. It is violence every day. Violence against people's lives and livelihoods. People are dying in his community. It's not the kind of dramatic violence we saw then. But so I just say to my brothers, Brooks and Michael, I put myself before you as not only a guy who's got a job, we all have day jobs, I'm a senator, but I'm willing to join in creative thought with you about what we can do collectively from this call to try to bring some more attention to what people conveniently ignore right now. And I know that first there has to be knowledge that triggers action. And if people do not have the knowledge about what's going on, that is so painful in our country, then it's hard to trigger that action. So I just push that out there. Vote, fill out your census forms. I can tell you the stuff that's normal in the realm of civic activism. But I think the level of this crisis has to call upon all of us to use our moral imagination to try to inspire the moral imagination of others.
Before Rev jump back in, Senator Booker, you just put an offer out there, and please understand, I'm gonna take you up on it. We're gonna come up with something to bring some highlight to these people that suffer. I think it's important that we see the impacts. We can hear the stories and they move us, but when you can mix the stories or couple the stories along with the actual imagery of what people go through, I think that it's important to see those who are forgotten.
Thank you so much. I think we're operating on the same wavelength, Senator, because it just so happens that Michael and I are planning to do our next webinar on how do we imagine creative action amid this pandemic, right? And so let's do it. Thank you so much for your leadership in pushing us toward that, because it's so vitally needed right now that we think creatively about what we can do to make a difference. Our tradition in doing these webinars is always to close with a call to action from Reverend Michael Malcom. So if you'd like to give some final words, Michael, that'd be much appreciated.
Yeah, I think COVID is now inviting us to reimagine how we work together to help our communities. We as communities of faith are called now in this particular time, especially when we can't safely meet together, to reach out to those who are already doing this work and partner with those. What would it look like for our congregations, our communities of faith, to adopt some of the nonprofits that do the work in our communities, to not only support them in finances, but also support them in manpower as well, or labor as well? What would it look like to make some open avenues for our communities, as well as with those who have those resources to help us? Again, Senator Booker, you put it out there. I'm going to take you up on it. Believe me, me and Reb will be reaching out to you to see what we can do to help our people. As long as we have the skills, as long as we have the privilege, it is for us to use that privilege and the skills that we have to ensure that all our people are free. When you have an opportunity, and if you have an opportunity, I invite you to go to www.armandarmforclimate, www.armandarmforclimate.org, and see what we're up to with starting the movement that we'll talk about later. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Malcom. And let me just give voice to the gratitude that is just filling up the chat box right now. Throughout this webinar, people have just been expressing their thanks for each of our panelists, and they continue just to be comment after comment giving thanks to each of you. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been truly informative and inspirational, and hopefully something that we can build upon to really make a difference in this world. Because I feel like this is really a moment of our calling, as the title of this webinar suggested. And our calling is rooted in love. And so we thank you so much for joining us and being with us and giving of your time and energy today. And thank you to all of our audience. We look forward to being with you again. I'll send out an email to all who registered with links from today and news about our next webinar coming up in the coming month. So thank you all. God bless and take care.
God bless you. Love you as well. Thank you. Much love to everybody.